You are an embarrassment to everything I've built. Sign the papers, or I will destroy what little life you think you have." Ethan Caldwell threw the divorce papers across the desk. They hit Charlotte in the chest and fell to the floor. She bent down, picked them up, smoothed them flat with both hands quietly, carefully, the way she had smoothed over every crack in his empire for 11 years without him ever knowing. Then she signed. Every line, no tears, no argument. She set the pen down, looked him directly in the eyes, and said the 7 words that would eventually cost him everything. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. There is a particular kind of cruelty that doesn't announce itself with shouting or violence. It arrives quietly, dressed in confidence and expensive cologne, wearing the face of a man who has convinced himself that his success is entirely his own creation. That was Ethan Caldwell on the night it all began. The anniversary gala for Caldwell Technologies was the kind of event that made Manhattan feel like it existed, for the sole purpose of hosting it. The venue, a converted neoclassical building in Midtown, had been rented for an obscene sum. The lighting was warm gold, the champagne was French, and cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. The guest list included senators, venture capitalists, 3 former Olympic athletes who had become investors, and at least 2 celebrities whose names alone had shifted stock prices in the past. Ethan moved through the crowd like a man who had rehearsed being worshipped. And in many ways he had. At 42, he was lean, sharp-jawed, and dressed in a suit that fit so well it seemed tailored by someone who had studied him for years, which of course someone had. His dark hair had a touch of silver at the temples, the kind that made him look distinguished rather than old. When he laughed, people around him laughed. When he paused before speaking, rooms went quiet to hear what came next. He had learned over 11 years at the top that presence was its own form of power. And tonight he was performing it flawlessly. What he was not doing, what he had no intention of doing, was looking for his wife. Charlotte Hayes Caldwell stood near the far edge of the room beside a window that overlooked the street below. She wore a deep navy dress, understated and elegant. Her dark hair was pinned back. She held a glass of sparkling water, not champagne, and she was listening patiently to an elderly board member tell a story she had almost certainly heard before. She was not miserable. That was the thing about Charlotte that most people missed. She wasn't the tragic, neglected wife of the stories, the woman barely holding herself together in the corner. She was calm, present. Her eyes were bright and attentive, even as her husband worked the opposite end of the room, as though they had arrived in separate cars from separate lives from separate planets, which in many ways they had. Mrs. Caldwell, a young associate from Ethan's PR team, appeared at her elbow. "Could I get you anything?" Mr. Caldwell wanted to make sure. "I'm fine," Charlotte said, and she smiled in a way that closed the conversation gently and completely. "Thank you." The associate retreated. Charlotte returned her gaze to the room. Her eyes found Ethan without effort, the way you always find someone you've studied for years, even in a crowd. He was standing near the center, close, too close, most would say, to Vanessa Brooks, the company's CFO. Vanessa was 35, brilliant in the way that certain people are brilliant when they have made ambition, their entire personality, and beautiful in the deliberate, calculated way that comes from understanding how beauty functions as currency in certain rooms. Vanessa was laughing at something Ethan said, her hand briefly touching his arm. Ethan didn't step back. Charlotte looked away. She took a slow sip of her water. The elderly board member was still talking. She smiled and nodded. "You looked bored tonight." The voice came from her right. Charlotte turned to find Marcus Webb, one of the company's original engineers, one of the few people at Caldwell Technologies who had been there from the very beginning, and one of the even fewer who treated Charlotte like a human being rather than an accessory. "I wasn't bored," Charlotte said. "I was thinking. Same thing in a room like this." Marcus glanced around the party with the mild distaste of someone who had seen too many of these events to be impressed by any of them. He was 50, stocky, with reading glasses perpetually perched on his forehead, and the permanent expression of a man who would rather be debugging code. "Did Ethan even say hello to you when you walked in?" Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Marcus nodded. "Right. It's a business event," Charlotte said. "He's working. He's been working at every event for the past 3 years." Marcus kept his voice low. Charlotte, I say this as someone who genuinely respects you. You deserve better than being a +1 in your own marriage." Charlotte looked at him, and for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, something moved behind her eyes. Not sadness exactly. Something older than sadness. Something like the slow, certain knowledge of a truth you have been carrying for years without letting yourself say it out loud. Then it was gone. "Enjoy the party, Marcus," she said quietly, and she went back to watching the room. It was after midnight when they arrived home. The house was a 9,000-square-foot townhouse on the Upper East Side, a beautiful, impeccable, almost aggressively perfect house that felt on most evenings like a museum after closing hours. Quiet, preserved, everything in its correct position. Ethan loosened his tie in the foyer without turning on the lights. Charlotte set her clutch on the hall table. For a moment, they simply existed in the same space. Two people who had once fit together like puzzle pieces and had gradually shifted until they no longer matched at any edge. "That went well?" Ethan said. "I think so," Charlotte agreed. A pause. "Vanessa thinks the Singapore deal could close faster than we projected." He said it conversationally, the way someone mentions the weather, as though the woman's name in his mouth required no navigation whatsoever. Charlotte looked at him. "Good," she said. Ethan finally turned, and something in Charlotte's steadiness seemed to irritate him, that particular steadiness that couldn't be shaken, that refused to perform the jealousy or hurt he perhaps expected, and perhaps on some level wanted to provoke. "Charlotte." He said her name like he was setting something down, like he was finally putting a heavy box on a table. "We need to talk." She waited. "This isn't working." He gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the house, at everything. "Us. This marriage. It hasn't been working for years, and I think we both know that." Charlotte said nothing. "I've been thinking," he continued, and his voice had that particular quality it got when he was delivering a rehearsed speech, when the words had been arranged in advance for maximum clarity and minimum argument, "that we've been holding each other back, that you would be happier, that I would be... Ethan." Her voice was gentle, not wounded, not angry, just certain. "Say what you mean." He met her eyes. "I want a divorce." The word fell into the room and sat there. Charlotte held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once slowly, the nod of someone who has already done the math, already run the calculation, already arrived at an answer before the question was fully asked. "All right," she said. Ethan blinked. That wasn't the response he had prepared for. "All right," he repeated. "All right," Charlotte said again calmly, "if that's what you want." He stopped, started again. "I thought you'd want to discuss it." "I don't think there's much to discuss." She picked up her clutch from the hall table. "I assume you'll have papers drawn up." "I already did," he said. And there it was, the confession beneath the conversation. He had already done it. The lawyers had already been contacted, the papers already drafted. This wasn't a discussion. This was a notification. Charlotte absorbed that without expression. "Of course you did," she said. She walked upstairs. Ethan stood alone in the dark foyer, and for the first time in the entire conversation, he felt something uncomfortable, a faint, unwanted sensation that he couldn't quite name, somewhere between guilt and unease, but he shook it off quickly. It was the right decision. I was certain of that. He went to pour himself a drink. The papers appeared on his desk the next morning. Ethan had placed them there himself, with a yellow sticky note indicating where Charlotte's signature was required. His lawyers had been thorough. The settlement offer was $20 million generous by any standard, and Ethan knew it. He had made certain the number was high enough that no one could accuse him of being unfair. High enough that it functioned in some psychological accounting he preferred not to examine too closely as an absolution. $20 million said, "I am not a bad man. I am simply moving forward." His assistant buzzed him at 10:15. "Mrs. Caldwell is here." "Send her in." Charlotte entered the office looking exactly as she always looked, unhurried, composed, wearing a simple gray dress that cost either $300 or $3,000 and was impossible to tell which. She carried no bag, no lawyer, no ally. She sat down across from him. He slid the papers across the desk. She looked at them for precisely the time it takes to read something carefully and completely. Her eyes moved across the pages with focus. She did not rush. She did not perform distress for his benefit. Then she reached for the pen. She signed on every indicated line quickly and without hesitation. Ethan watched her. He had expected, he realized only now, watching her hand move across the paper. He had expected something. Tears, possibly. An argument. A final attempt to change his mind, or failing that, a scene that would confirm his private narrative that Charlotte had always been too emotional, too fragile, too much. Instead, she capped the pen. She slid the papers back. She stood. "The 20 million, she said. "I don't want it." Ethan stared at her. "Charlotte, I don't need it." Her voice was entirely level. "Please direct it to whatever charitable fund your lawyers prefer. I have no interest in it." "That's," he searched for the word, "that's $20 million. "I know what it is," she said, and there was something in her tone, not contempt exactly, but a quiet precision, the tone of someone for whom $20 million is a number without particular weight, that stopped him. That made something cold move briefly through his chest. "You're serious," he said. "I'm always serious," she said. She moved toward the door, and then she stopped. She turned back and she looked at him the way you look at something you have studied for a very long time, something you understand deeply and completely, and she said, "Be careful, Ethan. Sometimes the person you underestimate is the one holding up your entire world." He almost said something dismissive. He almost laughed. In fact, he did laugh, a short, reflexive sound, the laugh of a man who has decided a warning doesn't apply to him. "I'll be fine, Charlotte." She held his gaze for one more second. "I know you believe that," she said, and she walked out. He poured his second coffee of the morning and told his assistant to get the Singapore team on a call. He did not think about Charlotte again until later that afternoon, when Marcus Webb appeared in his doorway, looking like a man who had just received news about a death in the family. "You signed the divorce papers," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "This morning," Ethan confirmed without looking up from his screen. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did she tell you anything before she left?" "She told me to be careful." Ethan finally looked up. "She said I was underestimating her, the classic exit line." He shrugged. "She'll be fine. She'll get a good therapist, reconnect with her family, probably move back to Geneva or wherever. She'll be fine." Marcus looked at him with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. "You've never met her father, have you?" Marcus said. It was not technically a question. "Richard Hayes, I've met him. Briefly. Twice." Ethan returned to his screen. "Retired businessman. Quiet man. Charlotte never talked about him much." "Did you ever wonder why she didn't talk about him much?" Ethan glanced up, mildly impatient now. "Marcus, I have a Singapore call in 20 minutes. "Right," Marcus said. "Sure." He started to leave, paused in the doorway. "For what it's worth, Ethan, I think you just made the most expensive mistake of your life. And I say that as someone who watched you make the decision to go public 12 months too late, which cost us about $300 million. This is worse." Ethan stared at him. "Goodbye, Marcus." Marcus left. Ethan sat in the silence for a moment, then deliberately, consciously set the feeling aside, the way he set aside every feeling that didn't serve his immediate goals. He had work to do. He had an empire to run. He had a future to build, finally at last, without anything holding him back. He picked up the phone. He did not notice, because he had no reason to notice, that, at almost the precise moment he was placing the Singapore call, his wife, his ex-wife, was boarding a private jet at Teterboro Airport. Not a commercial flight, a private jet, one that bore on its tail a small emblem, a constellation of connected nodes like a network diagram rendered in silver on deep blue, the logo of an organization that almost no one in Ethan Caldwell's world had ever heard of, and that controlled more of the world's economy than most governments. Charlotte settled into her seat. She looked out the window at the tarmac. She did not look back toward the city. She did not feel the need. She already knew what was behind her. What mattered now, what had always mattered, what she had been patient for long enough, was what was ahead. The first sign that something was wrong came 4 days later, and it came in the form of a phone call. Ethan was in the middle of a board presentation when his phone vibrated for the 4th time in 6 minutes, the kind of persistent, escalating vibration that has its own particular anxiety built into it. He stepped out briefly, and his general counsel was on the line. "We have a problem," David Nguyen said without preamble. "What kind of problem?" "Meridian Holdings just acquired Pinnacle Systems." Ethan went still. Pinnacle Systems was the company Caldwell Technologies had been moving to acquire for the past 8 months, a precision AI logistics firm that would have given Ethan's company a dominant position in the sector. The deal was weeks from closing. The due diligence was complete. The letters of intent were signed. This was supposed to be the move that cemented Caldwell Technologies as not just a major player, but the defining player in enterprise AI for the next decade. They can't have, Ethan said. The LOI wasn't exclusive, David said, his voice carrying the pained tone of a man delivering a diagnosis he had seen coming. And Meridian moved fast. The deal closed 2 hours ago. Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. Who is Meridian Holdings? A pause. That's the other part, David said. We're having trouble tracing them. The corporate structure is layered, multiple holding companies across 4 jurisdictions. But whoever they are, they paid a 40% premium over our offer price. In cash. Cash. A 40% premium. In cash. Ethan stood in the corridor outside the boardroom, and he felt for the first time in a very long time the cold, specific sensation of being outmaneuvered, not by someone who was better at the game, but by someone who wasn't playing the same game at all, someone who was playing a different game entirely, one with different pieces, different rules, and a board so large he hadn't even known it existed. Find out who Meridian is, he said. Everything. I don't care what it costs. Of course. He hung up. He went back into the boardroom. He finished the presentation. He smiled and answered questions, and performed the certainty that had made him famous. But his mind was elsewhere, and somewhere at the back of his thoughts, barely audible, barely articulate, so faint he dismissed it before it could fully form, was the echo of a woman's voice. Be careful, Ethan. Sometimes the person you underestimate is the one holding up your entire world. He pushed it away. He had a company to run. By the end of the week, it wasn't just Pinnacle Systems. Thornfield Manufacturing, which had been supplying Caldwell Technologies with critical semiconductor components for 7 years, sent notice of contract termination. The letter cited strategic realignment, the corporate equivalent of, we don't want to tell you the real reason. The contract had 18 months remaining. Thornfield's lawyers were prepared to negotiate an early exit penalty that was notably far smaller than what a 7-year relationship of this scale would typically demand, as though they were willing to absorb a loss simply to be free of the association. That same Thursday, Pacific Reach Logistics, the distribution and fulfillment partner responsible for Caldwell Technologies' entire Asia-Pacific supply chain, announced the same thing: strategic realignment. A buyout offer for the remaining contract term, structured generously, finalized quickly. Ethan called David and Gwyn. 2 in 1 week, he said. 3, David said. Vertex Cloud Infrastructure sent notice this morning. They're our backup cloud provider for European operations. Ethan sat very still. That's impossible, he said. Vertex has a 5-year agreement with us. We signed 18 months ago. Their lawyers found a compliance clause. Something about data sovereignty regulations in the new EU framework. It's technically defensible. David's voice was careful, measured the voice of a man who had not slept, and was choosing his words with great deliberateness. Ethan, I've been doing this for 23 years. I've seen hostile M&A. I've seen supply chain disruptions. I've seen coordinated activist investor campaigns. But this... He stopped. Say it, Ethan said. This feels coordinated, David said quietly. This feels like someone with a very large hand is systematically pulling the threads that hold this company together, one by one, carefully, methodically, not fast enough to be obvious, but fast enough to what? To be irreversible, David said. By the time we understand the full picture, the damage will already be done. The line was quiet. I want to know who's behind this, Ethan said. I want a name. We're working on it. Work faster. He hung up. He sat in his office in the building his name was on in the city that had made him a symbol of American technological ambition, and he stared at the wall. And a thought came to him, quiet, specific, unwanted, like a splinter working its way toward the surface. Charlotte had known. When she said those words to him, she had known. She hadn't been warning him out of bitterness or performing the wounded exit of a discarded wife. She had known. But what had she known, and what the thought arrived cold and heavy, settling into his chest with the specific weight of a truth that cannot be unfelt? What exactly had he signed away when he signed those papers? What had he let walk out of his office calmly, without tears, refusing $20 million? What had he let go? The answer came on a Sunday morning at 7:43 in the form of a text message from Marcus Webb. It said only this: "Look up Hayes Global Consortium, then call me." Ethan picked up his phone from the nightstand. He typed the name into a search engine. For a moment, nothing happened. That itself should have told him something, that the first layer of the internet, the layer everyone sees, returned almost nothing. A few academic references, a mention in a 2019 article about sovereign wealth fund structures, a brief notation in a Swiss financial publication translated, referring to it as among the most significant privately held multinational economic entities in the current global landscape. Among the most significant. Ethan frowned and kept scrolling. Then he found the profile. A deep dive investigative piece buried in the archive of a specialized financial journal, published 4 years ago and apparently read by very few people. He read it slowly. The Hayes Global Consortium, according to the article, was not a company in any conventional sense. It was a family-controlled network of entities holding companies' sovereign investment vehicles, strategic partnerships, and operational subsidiaries spread across dozens of countries. It controlled directly or indirectly significant stakes in global shipping, rare mineral extraction, critical energy infrastructure, private cloud and data architecture, and technology investment. The article estimated its total controlled economic value carefully, with caveats about the difficulty of measuring something so deliberately opaque at somewhere between $1.8 and $2.3 trillion. Trillion. Ethan stopped reading. He stared at the number. Then he read the line that came after it. The consortium was founded in the late 1960s by Swiss-American industrialist Richard Hayes, whose daughter Charlotte Hayes was confirmed by 3 independent sources as the designated successor of the organization's leadership role. Ethan sat up in bed. He read the sentence again. Charlotte Hayes, designated successor. He called Marcus. Marcus answered on the first ring. "You read it," Marcus said. "Tell me," Ethan said. His voice was very controlled, very precise. The voice of a man exercising an enormous amount of effort to sound like someone who is not afraid. "Tell me everything you know." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew about her family before you married her," he said. "Not everything, not the scale of it, but I knew her father wasn't just a retired businessman. I knew there was weight behind her, structure." He paused. "I never said anything because it wasn't my place to say, and because honestly, Ethan, I thought you knew. I assumed anyone who spent 11 years married to Charlotte Hayes would eventually understand who she was." Ethan's jaw was tight. "She never told me," he said. "No," Marcus said quietly. "She wouldn't have. That was Charlotte. She wasn't going to ask you to love her for her name or her family's money. She wanted—" He stopped. "What?" Ethan said. "She wanted you to see her," Marcus said simply. "Just her." The line was quiet. "Find me everything," Ethan said. "On Hayes Global, on Meridian Holdings, on every company that's cut ties with us this week. I want to know what connects them. I want to know if—" He stopped, because he already knew. He already knew even before Marcus confirmed it. He already knew who was behind Meridian Holdings. He already knew whose hand was methodically, patiently, with the calm precision of someone who had all the time and all the resources in the world, pulling the threads of his empire apart. He simply didn't want to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real. And if it was real, then everything that followed, every dismissal, every public slight, every night he had chosen Vanessa's laughter over Charlotte's quiet, every moment he had looked at his wife and seen only ordinariness, where there had always been so much more, would become not just cruelty. It would become the most catastrophic mistake of his life. He sat in his bedroom. The city moved outside his window. 11 stories down, taxis moved and people walked, and the world continued its relentless, indifferent forward motion. And Ethan Caldwell, who had never in his adult life felt truly, deeply, structurally afraid, sat very still, and understood for the first time that the woman who had walked out of his office 5 days ago, without looking back, had not been walking away from him. She had been walking towards something vast, something that had been waiting for her all along. And he had handed her the freedom to go there. He had signed the papers. He had laughed. He had poured himself a drink and scheduled a Singapore call. And now, only now, was he beginning to understand what he had actually done. The call from David Nguyen came at 6:47 on a Monday morning, 11 days after Charlotte walked out of Ethan's office. Ethan was already awake. He hadn't been sleeping well, not since the Meridian Holdings disaster, not since Marcus's Sunday morning text, not since he had sat in his bedroom reading the words designated successor over and over until the letters stopped making sense. But he had told himself repeatedly and with great conviction that he was managing the situation, that he was in control, that whatever was happening could be contained, explained, reversed. He answered the phone with the tone of a man who is performing confidence because the alternative is unacceptable. "Tell me something good," he said. David's pause lasted exactly long enough to communicate that there was nothing good to tell. "Ethan," he said, "I need you to come in, now, before the market opens." Ethan was in the car within 8 minutes. He arrived at the office to find his executive team already assembled in the main conference room: David, his COO, James Ritter, his head of investor relations, and 2 members of the legal team. They were arranged around the table with the specific body language of people who have been awake since 3 in the morning and have spent those hours watching something terrible unfold in slow motion and trying to determine how to describe it to someone who does not yet know. James Ritter spoke first because James always spoke first in crisis situations. It was perhaps his only truly reliable quality. "Stock is down 14% pre-market," James said. "It started moving at 4 a.m. Someone or multiple someones began selling a significant position overnight. We think it's coordinated. The volume pattern is not organic." Ethan sat down slowly. "How significant?" he said. "Enough to trigger momentum selling," David said. "By the time the market opens, we could be looking at 20–25% if we don't get ahead of it." "Then get ahead of it. Issue a statement. Call the major institutional holders. We tried," the head of investor relations said. Her name was Patricia Sohn, and she was one of the most unflappable people Ethan had ever employed. She was visibly shaken. "2 of our top 5 institutional holders are not taking calls this morning. A third told us directly off the record that they have received information suggesting significant structural problems with the company and are evaluating their position." "What information?" Ethan said. "What structural problems? We had a clean quarter. Our numbers are—" "The information didn't come from our financials," David said quietly. "It appears to have come from somewhere else. Someone has been communicating directly with our investors, providing analysis, detailed analysis of certain dependencies and vulnerabilities in our supply and infrastructure chain." The room went quiet. Ethan looked around the table. "Someone has been talking to our investors," he said slowly, "about our internal vulnerabilities." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to, because they all already knew on some level, even those who didn't yet have the full picture, that this wasn't a coincidence, that this wasn't a market correction, or a bad news cycle, or a competitor making a smart move. This was something else, something with a center, something that knew exactly where to press. "Find the source," Ethan said. His voice was very flat. "I don't care what you have to do. Find the source." He stood up and walked out of the conference room and into his office and closed the door behind him. He stood at the window. Below him, the city was waking up. And somewhere in that city, or perhaps in Geneva or Singapore or anywhere at all, because the woman he was thinking about apparently operated on a scale that made geography irrelevant, Charlotte Hayes was beginning her day. He picked up his phone. He found her contact. His thumb hovered over the call button. He put the phone down. He was not ready to make that call. He wasn't sure what he would say. He wasn't sure what he even believed yet. He needed more. He needed facts. He needed to understand the full shape of the thing before he confronted it directly. He went back to work. The market opened. Caldwell Technologies dropped 22% by noon. $3 billion in market value gone before lunch. Ethan didn't eat. By 2 in the afternoon, James Ritter knocked on his office door and entered without waiting for a response, which was how Ethan knew it was serious. "Hargrove Capital just filed a 13D, James said. Ethan turned from the window. They disclosed a position. Not a new position. James set a printed document on the desk. An activist position. They're calling for a strategic review of leadership and corporate structure. They've got 5.3% of the float. "Hargrove has never invested in us before," Ethan said. "No," James agreed. "They haven't." Another silence. "Find out who sold them that stake," Ethan said. James nodded and left. Ethan looked at the document on his desk. Strategic review of leadership and corporate structure. That was the polite corporate language for "we think the person running this company should not be running this company." He had written those words himself once in a letter targeting a rival CEO whose company he had wanted to acquire. He remembered the satisfaction of it, the precise, bloodless efficiency of the phrase, the way it could unravel someone's entire professional identity while maintaining the fiction of civility. He understood now what it felt like to be on the other side of it. He sat down at his desk. He put his head in his hands, just for a moment, just long enough to feel fully and without performance the specific weight of what was happening. Then he lifted his head, straightened his back, and picked up the phone. There were calls to make. There were always calls to make. But for the first time in 11 years of building this company, he wasn't entirely sure any of the calls would work. The feeling was new. He hated it completely. It was 3:17 in the afternoon on a Monday, and Ethan Caldwell was afraid. Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway at 3:45. He closed the door behind him. He sat down across from Ethan without being invited, which was something he had never done before in the 11 years they had worked together. Ethan looked at him. "You know something," Ethan said. "I've been doing research," Marcus said, "since Sunday, since I sent you that text." He placed a folder on the desk, physical paper printed, which was unusual for Marcus, who generally considered printing documents an unnecessary act of optimism. "I need you to look at something." Ethan opened the folder. It contained a series of documents, corporate filings, investment records, a timeline handwritten in Marcus's cramped engineer's script covering the past 11 years. "Start at the beginning," Marcus said. "Literally, year one. Year one. Caldwell Technologies, its first 18 months. The period Ethan almost never discussed publicly because it had been that close to catastrophic failure. He had started the company with good technology and terrible timing. The market had shifted. 2 of his founding engineers had left for a competitor, and a critical round of Series A funding had fallen apart 3 weeks before it was supposed to close. He had been in the specific and humiliating sense of the word broke. And then an anonymous investor had stepped in. An entity called Cornerstone Ventures, which Ethan had never been able to fully research, because at the time he hadn't cared at the time. He had simply been grateful, enormously and completely grateful, that the money had appeared when it did. Cornerstone had provided $2.4 million at terms more favorable than anything he could have negotiated at that moment in his company's life. The investment had saved everything. Ethan looked at the paper. Beside Cornerstone Ventures, Marcus had written 3 words: Hayes Global Consortium. Ethan looked up. "Keep reading," Marcus said. Year 3, the logistics crisis. A supplier dispute that had threatened to collapse Caldwell Technologies' first major enterprise contract, a deal that if lost would have ended the company's credibility before it had fully formed. The dispute had been resolved through the sudden, unexplained intervention of a third-party arbitration group that had connections apparently to the Pacific shipping industry. The contract was saved. Ethan had attributed it to luck and his own negotiating skill. Beside the entry, Marcus had written Hayes Global Pacific Rim Shipping Division, Year 5, the server crisis. A catastrophic infrastructure failure 3 days before a major product launch. A backup cloud provider had materialized seemingly out of nowhere, offering emergency capacity at cost, no markup, no questions. Ethan had launched on time. Critics had called it a masterclass in crisis management. Hayes Global Cloud Infrastructure Subsidiary. Year 7, the Washington moment. A regulatory threat that could have shut down Caldwell Technologies' government contracts division entirely. A private mediation that no one had ever fully explained involving a retired diplomat and 2 senators who suddenly became inexplicably supportive of Ethan's company. Hayes Global Policy and Government Relations Network. Year 9, the hostile takeover attempt. A competitor had begun quietly acquiring Caldwell Technologies' stock building toward a controlling position. The attempt had collapsed when a mysterious block of institutional investors' entities that Ethan had never identified had consolidated their voting power against it. He had told the press it was a testament to investor confidence in his leadership. Hayes Global, Hayes Global, Hayes Global. Ethan closed the folder. He sat very still. The office was quiet. Outside, the city continued its indifferent, relentless movement. Inside, something was rearranging itself. The architecture of 11 years of self-understanding, shifting and cracking and revealing what had always been beneath. "Every time I was about to lose it," Ethan said slowly, not as a question, just as a statement he was making to himself in order to make it real. Every single time. Every single time, Marcus confirmed. She was there. Someone connected to her family was there. Whether she directed it personally or whether her father operated independently, I don't know. What I know is that the pattern is... Marcus stopped. Ethan, the pattern is 11 years long. It is consistent. It is specific. It targeted the exact moments when your company was most vulnerable, and it intervened with exactly the right tool each time. He leaned forward. That is not coincidence. That is not luck. That is someone who understood your company as well as you did, possibly better, and chose over and over again to keep it alive. Ethan was not a man who showed emotion easily. He had built his entire professional identity on the appearance of unshakable certainty. But his hands flat on the desk pressed slightly harder against the surface. She never said a word, he said. No, Marcus said. She didn't. 11 years, not one word. Not one. Ethan stood abruptly. He walked to the window. His back was to Marcus, which was perhaps the only reason he let himself feel the full weight of what he was feeling, the specific breathtaking force of realizing that you have spent 11 years dismissing something you could not afford to lose, that you have confused silence with emptiness, stillness with insignificance, and quiet loyalty with the absence of value. Why? He said. His voice was rougher than he intended. Why would she do that? Keep it secret. She could have told me. She could have... Could she? Marcus said quietly. Think about how you would have reacted. At year 1 year, 3 year, 5. If Charlotte had walked up to you and said, my family's $1 trillion organization just saved your company, what would you have done? Ethan was silent. I knew the answer. He knew it immediately and completely, the way you sometimes know things about yourself that you would prefer not to know. He would have been furious. He would have felt diminished. He would have called it manipulation, interference, and undermining of his autonomy. He would have rejected it, and possibly in rejecting it destroyed everything. She had known that. She had known him well enough to know that the only way to help him was to do it invisibly, to give him the gift of his own success, while bearing none of the credit to hold the foundation steady while he stood on top of it and told the world he had built it alone. She loved you, Marcus said. Not harshly, just plainly. In whatever complicated, enormous, quiet way she was capable of, she loved you. And you... Don't, Ethan said. Marcus stopped. The word hadn't been angry. It had been something worse than angry. It had been the sound of a man who cannot hear the rest of the sentence because he already knows exactly how it ends. The two men stood in silence for a long moment. Then Ethan's phone rang. It was David and Gwyn. He answered. 2 more, David said. Kinetic Data Partners and Brennan Ross Logistics. Both sending termination notices. Both citing strategic realignment. Ethan. His voice dropped. I traced the holding structure on Meridian Holdings, the one that bought Pinnacle Systems. And, Ethan said, 14 layers of subsidiaries, but at the bottom... David stopped. There's a Swiss-registered entity called Novaline Partners, and Novaline is a wholly owned subsidiary of Hayes Capital Holdings. Ethan closed his eyes. Hayes, he repeated. Hayes, David confirmed. As in, I don't know how to say this without it sounding insane, as in the same Hayes as... I know who it is, Ethan said. He hung up. He turned back from the window. Marcus was watching him with the expression of a man who has delivered a diagnosis and is waiting to see what the patient does next. She's doing this, Ethan said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement of fact spoken aloud to test how it sounded, to measure the weight of it against the air. Her family's organization is doing this, Marcus said carefully, whether Charlotte is personally directing it. She walked out of my office 11 days ago, Ethan said. 4 days later, Meridian moved on Pinnacle. 7 days later, 3 suppliers drop us simultaneously. 10 days later, activist investors appear from nowhere, and our stock drops 22% in a single day. He looked at Marcus. Either Charlotte is directing this, or the moment she stepped away, the invisible infrastructure she had built around this company, the infrastructure I didn't even know existed, started collapsing. Marcus was quiet. Maybe both, he said finally. Maybe both. The words sat in the room. Ethan thought about Charlotte's face as she signed the papers, the absolute composure of it, the steadiness of her hand. He had interpreted it as coldness, as indifference, as the emotional flatness of a woman who had given up caring. He understood now that it was something else entirely. It was the composure of someone who had already made a decision, who had already calculated what would happen next, who had signed those papers not as an ending, but as a beginning, the moment at which she stopped protecting something that had stopped deserving protection. He had laughed at her warning. He could still hear himself laughing. The sound of it in memory was the worst thing he had experienced all day, worse than the stock drop, worse than the supplier terminations, worse than the activist filing. He reached for his phone again. He found Charlotte's contact. This time he pressed call. It rang 3 times. Then a recorded message, a standard voicemail prompt in Charlotte's calm, clear voice. He had heard this message hundreds of times over 11 years. It had never felt significant before. "Charlotte," he said after the tone, "we need to talk. I know you know what's happening, and I know why." He paused. Another pause. Longer. "Please call me back." He hung up. She did not call back. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not by the end of the week. He called twice more. He sent one email, carefully worded, professionally toned, because he did not yet know how to write to her in any other register. He received no response. She had become, in the space of less than 2 weeks, as unreachable as the organization behind her present, everywhere in its effects, invisible in itself. He could feel the movement of her decisions in every contract termination and investor withdrawal and supply chain disruption. But he could not reach her, could not see her, could not sit across from her and make her understand. What exactly? What was it he wanted her to understand? That he was sorry. Was he sorry? He sat with that question for a long time one evening alone, in a house that was quieter than it had ever been, in a marriage that no longer existed, in a life that was beginning to look remarkably different from the one he had been certain was his. I thought about the first year, the anonymous investment that had saved everything. Charlotte had known at the time exactly what her family had done. She had sat across from him at dinner while he told her proudly about the mysterious investor that had appeared out of nowhere, and she had listened, and she had nodded, and she had said, "I'm glad it worked out." And he had heard in those words nothing more than a supportive wife offering a supportive response. He understood now that she had been exercising a restraint that had probably cost her something real. To listen to the man you love take credit for a salvation you quietly arranged to choose again and again to protect his sense of himself over your own acknowledgement, that was not passivity. That was not weakness. That was a kind of love he had never thought to recognize because it had never asked to be recognized. And he had responded to it by throwing divorce papers across a desk, by telling her she was an embarrassment, by laughing at her warning. He poured a drink he didn't finish. He went to bed he couldn't sleep in. And 3 floors below, in the lobby of the building, the night security guard, a man who had worked the night shift in this building for 4 years and had always liked Mrs. Caldwell, who remembered his name and occasionally brought him coffee on late nights, looked at the empty lobby and thought, without quite knowing why, that the building felt different recently. Lighter in some way, as though something substantial had quietly left. He wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, in Geneva, Charlotte Hayes walked into the boardroom of Hayes Global Consortium for the first time without her father sitting at the head of the table. Richard Hayes, 71 years old, precise silver-haired, with the contained energy of someone who has spent 50 years making decisions that moved markets without anyone knowing his name, sat instead to her right, as her advisor, as her counsel, as her father who had waited a very long time for this day and felt watching his daughter take her seat at the head of the table something very close to joy. The room was full of people directors, analysts, regional heads who had in various capacities over the past decade been informed of Charlotte's existence and her eventual role without ever meeting her directly. She had lived for 11 years as the hidden daughter, the one who had stepped back deliberately to build her own understanding of the world from inside an ordinary life, the one who had chosen a marriage and a quieter existence, not as an escape from her inheritance, but as a self-imposed education, learning what it meant to be unseen, to operate without power backing, to love someone who knew nothing of what you came from. The education was complete. Charlotte sat at the head of the table. She looked at the room looked at her. "Let's begin," she said. Her voice was calm. Her voice was entirely, completely, unshakably calm. And in that boardroom in the center of an empire that had quietly touched every corner of the world for 50 years, Charlotte Hayes was finally fully and without apology herself. What she intended to build next would make everything that had come before look like a rough draft. and Ethan Caldwell, sitting alone in a darkened room 4,000 miles away, pouring a drink he wouldn't finish, had no idea that the worst was not even close to over. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Charlotte had taken her seat at the head of the Hayes Global Boardroom in Geneva. Ethan almost didn't open it. His assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, who had recently developed the careful, measured tone of someone working for a man whose company was visibly unraveling, placed it on his desk between two urgent legal memos and a draft statement for an investor call he was dreading. The envelope was heavy cream stock, embossed lettering, the kind of physical mail that almost no one sent anymore, which meant the people who still sent it understood that the rarity itself communicated something. The Global Technology Leadership Summit, Manhattan, 4 weeks from Thursday, black tie, by invitation only. Ethan had attended this summit 3 times before, always as a featured speaker, always as one of the names that drew the room. This year he had not been asked to speak. The invitation was general admission, the kind sent to people who mattered enough to include, but not enough to feature. That alone told him everything about how far his reputation had fallen in 8 weeks. He set the invitation aside. Priya lingered in the doorway. "There's something else," she said, "about the summit." He looked up. "Charlotte Hayes is listed as a keynote speaker," she said. She said it quickly, the way you say something that you know will land hard and want to get past as fast as possible. "She's closing the evening session. The announcement went out this morning. It's already generating a lot of coverage." Ethan picked up the invitation again. He looked at it for a long time. "Clear my schedule for that Thursday," he said. Priya nodded and left without another word. He put the invitation in his desk drawer. He did not take it out again, but he thought about it every single day for the next 4 weeks. He thought about it while reviewing the damage reports that crossed his desk with increasing frequency, more supplier withdrawals, more investor departures. The quiet exodus of mid-level executives who had begun sensing which direction the wind was blowing and were updating their resumes accordingly. He thought about it during the board meeting where 3 directors asked, with the polite brutality of people who had made their decision before sitting down, whether Ethan had considered bringing in external leadership to stabilize the company. He thought about it at night in the house that echoed now in a way it never had when Charlotte was in it, when the silence had enough weight to it that it felt almost like a presence of its own. He thought in those quiet hours about what Marcus had told him. He thought about Cornerstone Ventures and the $2.4 million that had arrived at the exact moment his company was dying. I thought about a dinner somewhere in year 2 of their marriage, when Charlotte had asked him casually over pasta, with the tone of someone making idle conversation, how he would handle a logistics failure if his primary supplier ever went dark without warning. He had answered in the confident, dismissive way. He answered most of her questions about his business because he had believed without ever examining the belief that her interest was decorative, that she was asking because spouses asked. Not because she was already thinking 3 steps ahead of a problem he hadn't yet seen coming. She had been mapping his vulnerabilities, not to exploit them, to protect him from them. The thought arrived differently each time it came, sometimes as grief, sometimes as something that felt embarrassingly close to awe, sometimes as a cold, specific fury directed entirely at himself. He poured himself a drink on those nights and did not sleep much. 4 weeks passed. The summit arrived. He put on his best suit, the charcoal one, the one Charlotte had once told him made him look like a man who had earned the room, and he went. The venue was a converted landmark building near Central Park, the kind of space that had been rented for this event, at a cost that communicated the summit's own opinion of its importance. Ethan arrived early enough to claim a position near the center of the room where he could see the stage and the entrance both. He ordered a sparkling water he didn't drink. Maimad small talk with 2 venture capitalists who seemed slightly uncertain of how to interact with him, now whether to treat him as the power player he had been 6 months ago, or the diminished figure the financial press had spent 8 weeks describing. He smiled. He was charming. He performed with considerable skill the version of himself that still believed he was in control. At 7:15, the room had filled to perhaps 300 people, presidents of companies, heads of sovereign wealth funds, 3 sitting senators, a former Secretary of State. The specific density of influence in the room was the kind you could almost feel physically, a pressure in the air, a heightened quality of attention. The collective awareness of people who understood that what happened in rooms like this rippled outward into the world in ways ordinary rooms did not. Ethan was working through a conversation with a hedge fund manager when he felt it. Not heard it, felt it. A shift in the room's energy, a change in the direction of attention, subtle at first, then sudden and complete, the way a school of fish turns in the water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The ambient noise dropped by half in the space of 3 seconds. Ethan turned. Charlotte walked in at 7:19. She was not alone. There were 2 aides behind her, and to her left, Richard Hayes himself, 71 years old, and carrying the absolute unhurried authority of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he had ever entered for 50 years. But it was Charlotte that the room was responding to, and Ethan understood with a force that was almost physical. Why? She wore midnight blue structured architectural, the kind of dress that required someone who knew exactly who they were to wear it, without the dress wearing them. Her hair was down for the first time, and he tried to remember the last time he had seen her hair down at a public event, and could not. Her posture was the same as it had always been, straight, unhurried, present. But the frame around it had changed entirely. The invisible apology she had always seemed to carry in public, the slight diminishment, the careful not taking up of space, was simply gone. What was there instead was something Ethan recognized from boardrooms and negotiating tables, and the faces of the very few people who had truly arrived at certainty about who they were. She looked like someone who had come home. The room moved toward her, the way water moves toward a drain, not chaotically, but with the helpless directional pull of something obeying a law of nature. A senator was first extending his hand, saying something that made Charlotte smile. Not the careful, managed smile Ethan had watched her deploy for 11 years at events like this, but something real, something that reached her eyes. Then a sovereign fund director. Then 2 tech executives whose names appeared on the covers of the same magazines Ethan's name had appeared on 6 months ago. Then the former Secretary of State physically crossed the room to reach her. Ethan stood perfectly still. His sparkling water was still in his hand. He had not moved. Around him, the conversations had resumed, but their texture had changed. They were about her now, about who she was, about the announcement that was apparently coming, about the fact that Richard Hayes himself was here, which meant this was not simply a keynote speech but something larger, something that the people in this room who paid attention to the movements of real power had already been tracking with considerable interest. Ethan heard fragments. Hayes Nexus, the prototype data they released last month, is extraordinary. Richard's been positioning this for years. Apparently she was always the plan. I heard the platform integrates logistics, AI, and infrastructure in a way that makes most current enterprise systems look like... He stopped listening, because Charlotte had looked up. Across the room, through 300 people and a decade of accumulated damage, her eyes found his. She didn't look away. Neither did he. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, they simply looked at each other. And in those seconds, Ethan felt the full, unmanageable weight of everything he understood now that he had not understood before, who she was, what she had given, what he had thrown away, and the precise and irreversible nature of the distance between where they were standing. Then someone touched Charlotte's arm, and she turned, and she was gone back into the current of the room. Ethan put his sparkling water down on a passing tray. He needed something stronger. James Ritter appeared at his shoulder from nowhere, looking pale. "Did you know she was going to be here?" James said. "Yes," Ethan said. "Did you know about Hayes Nexus, what they're apparently announcing tonight?" "I knew something was coming." He had known for 3 weeks, since an analyst report had circulated in the financial press about a new platform being developed under the Hayes Global umbrella, a platform that, according to 3 independent technical reviewers who had seen early demonstrations, represented a genuinely new architecture for enterprise logistics and AI integration, not an iteration on existing systems, but a structural departure from them. He had read the report. He had read it 3 times. Each time his chest had done something unpleasant that he hadn't given himself permission to fully name. The market analysts are saying it could be the most significant enterprise platform launch in a decade, James said. "If what the preview data shows is real." "It's real," Ethan said quietly. James looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because she built it," Ethan said, "and she doesn't do things halfway." James had no response to that. He drifted back into the crowd. Ethan stood alone. The program began at 8. The earlier speakers were good, competent, polished, the kind of presentations this room expected and received with attentive respect. Ethan sat through them and heard almost nothing. His attention was on the stage, on the clock, on the moment that was coming. At 9:40, the MC, a smooth-voiced journalist who hosted a prominent financial television program, stepped to the microphone and said, "Our final speaker tonight needs very little introduction. Though I suspect most of you are about to discover that what you thought you knew about her was considerably less than the full picture. Please welcome Charlotte Hayes." The room applauded. Charlotte walked onto the stage. She stood at the podium and looked at the room, and for a moment she said nothing. Just looked with a composure so complete it functioned as its own form of command. 12 years ago, she said, and her voice through the speakers was clear and measured, and entirely without performance. "Someone told me that the most powerful thing a person can do is choose to be invisible, to operate without credit, to build without taking up the space that building usually demands." She paused. "I spent a long time believing that was wisdom. I spent a long time living by it." The room was absolutely silent. "I don't believe it anymore," she said, and she began. What followed was 40 minutes that Ethan would, for the rest of his life, struggle to describe accurately. Not because it was technically beyond his understanding, but because the technical content was almost secondary to the experience of watching Charlotte Hayes stand in front of 300 of the most powerful people in the world and be simply and completely, and without a single moment of apology, herself. Hayes Nexus, as she described it, was not a product. It was an infrastructure, a platform that integrated global logistics management, predictive AI, real-time supply chain response, and cloud architecture into a single unified system that operated at a scale no existing enterprise technology had achieved. She had spent 4 years developing it, she said, 4 years during which she had maintained the quiet life that certain people in this room might remember her from. 4 years during which she had attended corporate galas, as a background figure, smiled politely at people who looked through her, and gone home every evening to the work that actually consumed her. At the 20-minute mark, she unveiled the preliminary performance data. Ethan heard the sound the room made when the numbers appeared on the screen behind her. It was not applause, it was something more involuntary than applause. A collective intake of breath, the sound of 300 very sophisticated people simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what was possible. Hayes Nexus outperformed every comparable enterprise system in the market. Not marginally, not by the incremental percentages that normally constituted competitive advantage in this space. In processing efficiency, it outperformed Caldwell Technologies' flagship enterprise product by 63%. In predictive accuracy, by 41%. In integration capacity, the ability to function across existing infrastructure without requiring complete system replacement, it was, according to the independent technical review, Charlotte cited in a different category entirely. A different category entirely. Ethan sat very still in his chair. Beside him, a woman he didn't know, a hedge fund manager, he thought mid-50s, someone who had probably seen hundreds of product launches, whispered to her colleague, "My God." At the 35-minute mark, Charlotte announced the first wave of enterprise clients who had already signed agreements with Hayes Nexus. The list appeared on the screen. Ethan read it and felt the room tilt. 4 of the names on that list were companies that had terminated contracts with Caldwell Technologies in the past 8 weeks, not because they had been pushed away, because they had been pulled towards something better, something that had been coming for years, quietly and visibly built by a woman that everyone in those companies had at some point looked past. The applause when Charlotte finished was not the polite professional applause of a summit audience acknowledging a competent presentation. It was the response of people who understood they had watched something that mattered, something they would describe to other people tomorrow, something that had shifted a landscape they operated within. Charlotte stood at this podium as the applause continued, and she nodded once, gracious, unhurried, entirely at ease. And Ethan thought, watching her, that he had never in 11 years of marriage seen her look like this, had never given her the space or perhaps the reason to look like this. She stepped back from the podium. She found him in the crowd immediately, as though she had known exactly where he was sitting for the entire 40 minutes. Their eyes met again, across the room, across everything. He stood up. She held his gaze for one moment, just one, and then she turned to speak to Richard, who had appeared at her side, and the moment closed. Ethan moved through the crowd toward her. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have prepared words. He had nothing except the urgent, disorganized understanding that he needed to be close enough to speak to her, that he could not let this night end with the distance of a gaze across a ballroom as the sum total of what passed between them. It took him 6 minutes to reach her, because 6 minutes was how long it took to navigate through 300 people all moving in the same direction. He was stopped twice, once by a former business associate offering condolences about the company's performance with the particular relish of someone who had always resented him, and once by a journalist who wanted a quote about Hayes' Nexus and whether he saw it as competitive to his own platform. Significantly, Ethan said and kept moving. He reached her. She was between conversations, a brief open moment, her aide 2 steps to the left, her father engaged with a senator nearby. "Charlotte," he said. She turned. Up close, the composure was the same as it had always been, and also not the same at all. It was the composure of someone who was no longer managing anything, who had nothing to protect, nothing to hide, nothing to fear from whatever he might say. "Ethan," she said. His throat was tight. There were 1,000 things he had rehearsed in various forms over the past 8 weeks. None of them came. What came instead was, "Why didn't you tell me?" Charlotte looked at him steadily. "Which part?" she said. "Any of it," he said. "Your family, what they built, what you did for the company, for 11 years. Why didn't you tell me?" She was quiet for a moment. Around them the room moved and breathed and laughed, indifferent to the conversation happening in its center. "I told you the parts that mattered," she said. "I told you I believed in you. I told you I was proud of what you were building. I told you," I said it directly, "Ethan, more than once, that you were undervaluing the people closest to you." She paused. "You didn't want to hear it. You heard what fit the story you'd decided was true. That's not a failure of communication. That's a failure of attention." The words landed cleanly. Not cruelly, she wasn't delivering them with cruelty. She was simply saying true things in the tone of someone for whom the time for softening true things had passed. "I know," he said. And he did know. That was the specific agony of it. Not that she was wrong, but that she was entirely right, and that understanding it now was perfectly, completely useless. "I'm sorry," he said. Something moved through her expression. Brief, real, gone. "I know you are," she said. "Is there—" He stopped, started again. "Is there anything—" "Ethan." Her voice was gentle now, and the gentleness was somehow worse than anything else she could have offered, because it was the gentleness of finality, the tone of someone who has fully grieved something and arrived at the other side of it. "I spent 11 years being sorry on your behalf, for every person you dismissed, every moment you took without gratitude, every time you stood in a room full of people who loved you and looked straight through them." She met his eyes. "I can't do that anymore. I don't have anything left to apologize for, and neither do you, really. What's done is done." His jaw was tight. "That's it," he said. 11 years, and that's— 11 years, she said, "and you signed the divorce papers in under 24 hours, offered me $20 million, like I was a vendor you were settling a contract with, and laughed when I told you to be careful." She said it without heat, without bitterness, with the flat, clean precision of someone stating facts. "I'm not punishing you, Ethan. I want you to understand that. What's happening to your company isn't punishment, it's consequence. There's a difference." He stared at her. "I never needed your money," she said. "I never needed your connections or your validation or a place on your magazine covers. I wanted—" She stopped, and for just a moment, one real unguarded moment, something behind her eyes cracked slightly. Not enough to break, just enough to show that it had been there, the want, the hope, the years of it. "I wanted your respect," she said. "That's all, just that." The words went through him like something physical, before he could respond, before he could find anything that came close to adequate. Charlotte's aide stepped forward and murmured something in her ear. She nodded. She looked at Ethan one final time. "Take care of yourself," she said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it, and that was perhaps the hardest part, that after everything she still meant it. She turned and walked toward the group of industry leaders who were waiting to speak with her, and Ethan stood in the center of the room and watched her go. His phone buzzed. He looked at it mechanically. It was David Nguyen. The text said, "You need to see this. Market futures reacting to the Hayes Nexus announcement. We're down another 9% in after-hours trading." He put the phone in his pocket without responding. He looked at Charlotte across the room, now surrounded, animated, fully and completely in her element, and he understood something he hadn't fully understood before that moment. This was not about him anymore. It had stopped being about him the moment she signed those papers. She hadn't dismantled his empire to hurt him. She hadn't built hers to defeat him. She had simply stopped holding things together for someone who had never bothered to notice they were being held, and then she had gone on to build something real, something that was hers entirely, and finally hers built on her own name, her own intelligence, her own years of quiet, patient preparation. He had been a chapter. She was writing an entirely different book now. He walked out of the venue alone ahead of the crowd into the city night. Behind him, through the closed doors, he could hear the sound of the room still alive, still responding to her, the energy of it carrying through the walls. He stood on the sidewalk and listened to it for a moment. Then he put his hands in his pockets and walked toward the street to get a car. His phone buzzed again. He didn't look at it. There would be time for that, for the damage reports and the investor calls and the board meetings and the lawyers and everything else that was waiting for him on the other side of this night. There would be time for all of it. But right now, standing on a sidewalk in Manhattan, while the city moved around him in its relentless, indifferent way, Ethan Caldwell understood with a completeness and a clarity that no amount of money or success or applause had ever given him exactly what he had lost, and exactly how much of it had been his own doing. The car arrived. He got in. He said nothing to the driver. He watched the lights of the city move past the window and thought about a woman in a midnight blue dress who had looked at him across a crowded room with eyes that held not a single trace of uncertainty. And he rode in silence back towards a life that was waiting for him, a life that was about to get considerably harder. The morning after the summit, Ethan's phone had 47 unread messages by the time he woke up at 5:43. I didn't reach for it immediately. He lay in the dark of the bedroom and stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence of the house which had developed over the past 3 months, its own specific quality, not the comfortable silence of a home at rest, but the hollow, resonant silence of a space that had lost something it was built around. He had stopped noticing it for a while. Tonight he noticed it completely. He reached for the phone. The messages arranged themselves in order of severity, the way bad news always does when it accumulates overnight without anyone to intercept it. David Nguyen had sent 6. James Ritter had sent 4. His personal attorney had sent 2, which was unusual enough to make his chest tighten. Patricia Sohn had sent one at 2:17 in the morning, which said only, "Call me when you're up. It's not good." There were also 11 messages from journalists, and one sent at 11:58 the previous night from a number he didn't recognize, which contained only a link to a financial news article and no accompanying text. He clicked the link. The headline read, "Hayes Nexus launch triggers sector rout Caldwell Technologies loses 31% in after-hours trading, 31%. He put the phone face down on the nightstand. He lay there for exactly 40 seconds, which was how long it took him to calculate in rough terms what 31% of his remaining market capitalization represented. The number he arrived at was large enough and specific enough that it had a physical quality, a weight that settled somewhere between his sternum and his stomach and stayed there. Then he got up, because lying in the dark was not something he was capable of for very long. He showered, he dressed, he made coffee with the focused, methodical attention of a man performing normalcy as an act of discipline. He called David at 6:15. David answered immediately, which meant he hadn't slept. "Tell me," Ethan said. "The after-hours number stabilized around 28%, David said. "It could recover partially when the market opens, but the analyst reports that went out after midnight are they're not good, Ethan. 3 major firms downgraded us to sell overnight. One of them called Hayes Nexus a structural disruption to the enterprise AI sector and named us specifically as the company most exposed." "Most exposed," Ethan repeated. "Our flagship product overlaps with Hayes Nexus in every primary category. We're not their only competitor, but we're—" David paused. "We're the most visible one. The press has already started framing it as a direct competition. Charlotte versus you, the ex-wife and the—" He stopped himself. "Say it," Ethan said. "The ex-husband whose company is in free fall," David said quietly. "I'm sorry, that's how they're framing it." Ethan's jaw worked. "What does the board look like?" he said. A pause that lasted 2 seconds too long. "I got a call from Gerald Marsh at 10 last night," David said. Gerald Marsh was the lead independent director on Caldwell Technologies' board, a 64-year-old former Fortune 500 CEO who had been with the company since its IPO and who communicated exclusively in understatement. He said he thought it would be constructive if you and he had breakfast before the week was out. Ethan knew what that meant. He had been on the other side of that breakfast before the polite early morning meeting that preceded the polite formal conversation that preceded the not-so-polite board resolution. He had initiated 3 such breakfasts in his career targeting other CEOs. He had never imagined sitting in the chair on the other side of it. "Set it up," he said. "Already did," David said. "Thursday, 7:30, he chose the restaurant." Of course he did. "Anything else?" Ethan said. "Vanessa wants to meet," David said. "Of course she does." He hung up and stood in his kitchen with his coffee going cold and the city beginning to lighten outside the window. Vanessa Brooks arrived at the office at 9 sharp. She was, as always, impeccably put together, the kind of composure that had always read to Ethan as strength, and that he now understood with the specific clarity of someone who had recently been in the presence of the real thing, was something considerably more fragile. Vanessa's composure was constructed. Charlotte's had been earned. There was a difference, and he had spent 11 years getting it exactly backwards. She sat across from him and crossed her legs and looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "We need to talk about my position," she said. He had been expecting this conversation. He had been expecting it since the summit, since the moment the after-hours numbers had started moving. He had known with the certainty that comes from understanding how certain people operate, that Vanessa would time her exit with precision, not too soon, which would look reactive, and not too late, which would look desperate, but at exactly the moment when leaving still carried the appearance of choice. That moment, apparently, was this morning. "Your position," he said. "I've received an offer," she said. "A significant one. I wanted to tell you directly out of respect for what we've built together." "What we've built," he said. There was something in his voice that made her blink, a flatness, an absence of the warmth she was accustomed to. "Who made the offer?" She hesitated. "Barely." But he caught it. "A firm in Singapore," she said. "Vanessa." His voice was patient, precise. "Who made the offer?" Another hesitation. "Hayes Nexus," she said. The words sat between them. Ethan looked at her and felt something he hadn't expected. Not betrayal, not anger, not even the particular humiliation of watching someone choose the competition. What he felt was something close to exhaustion, a tiredness so complete it had moved past emotion into something more like clarity. "Of course," he said. "It's a remarkable opportunity." "I'm sure it is," he said. "When do you leave?" She blinked again. She had prepared for a different kind of conversation, for negotiation, for appeals to loyalty, for the performance of persuasion and counteroffer. She had not prepared for this. "End of month," she said. "I'll have HR process the transition," he said. "Thank you for telling me directly." She stood. She smoothed her jacket. She started for the door and then stopped, and he could see her wrestling with something, some impulse that was either genuine or very well performed. "For what it's worth," she said without turning fully around, "I always thought you were the smartest person in the room." "I wasn't," Ethan said simply. She left. He sat alone. By noon, 2 senior vice presidents had submitted formal resignations. By 3 in the afternoon, a third had followed. Each resignation letter cited personal career development and new opportunities, and each one was a small, clean knife to the same wound, delivered with corporate politeness and timed, he suspected, with an awareness of the current direction of the wind. Marcus appeared in the doorway at 3:40. "3 VPs in one day," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "The engineering team is spooked. There are conversations happening in the hallways that weren't happening a month ago." Marcus came in and sat down uninvited, as always. "People are updating their LinkedIn profiles." "I know that too." "What's the plan?" Marcus said. Not challengingly, genuinely, with the tone of a man who was still there, still present, still asking, which was itself remarkable given the circumstances, and which Ethan registered imperfectly and belatedly as exactly the kind of loyalty he had spent 11 years failing to properly value. "The board is going to move by the end of the month," Ethan said. "Marsh wants breakfast Thursday. That's the setup." And I'm going to that breakfast," Ethan said. "And I'm going to listen, and I'm going to make whatever decisions need to be made." He looked at Marcus. "I'm not going to fight it if that's what you're asking. I'm not going to dig in and make this uglier than it has to be." Marcus studied him. "That doesn't sound like you," he said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It doesn't." Something passed across Marcus's expression, something between surprise and a sorrow that had no clean name. "She really got to you," Marcus said. Not unkindly, just observationally, the way Marcus said most things. "She told the truth," Ethan said. "That's all. She just told me the truth and I finally heard it." He paused. "It only took losing everything." Marcus had nothing to say to that. They sat in the quiet of the office, and outside the city continued its business, and somewhere across the market in real time on screens that Ethan no longer needed to check because the number was already in his body, already part of the ongoing education he was receiving, Caldwell Technologies continued its slow, irreversible descent. Thursday morning arrived with the specific quality of mornings that carry things you cannot put back once they are said. Gerald Marsh was already seated when Ethan arrived, which communicated in the precise language of power dynamics that Marsh had arrived early to claim the psychological ground. He was a large man, gray-suited with the manner of someone who had delivered difficult verdicts many times and had developed a style for it that was humane without being soft. He stood to shake Ethan's hand. His grip was firm and brief. "Thank you for coming," Marsh said, as though Ethan had had a choice. They ordered. Neither of them looked at the menu for long. Marsh waited until the coffee arrived. Then he said, "The board met informally on Tuesday evening." "I assumed?" Ethan said. "The consensus," Marsh began. "Gerald," Ethan set his coffee cup down. "Just say it." Marsh looked at him, and something in his expression, some small genuine thing, shifted. "The board believes a leadership transition is necessary for the company's survival," Marsh said. "The recommendation is that you step down as CEO by the end of the quarter. We would like to work with you on selecting your successor and structuring a transition that protects—" "I'll step down by the end of the month," Ethan said. Marsh stopped. "The end of that's faster than—" "The company doesn't have the luxury of a slow transition right now," Ethan said. "Every day I'm in that chair is another day the press writes the story the way they're writing it. Another day, the employees wonder whether to stay or go. Another day, the investors wait to see which way the board jumps." He met Marsh's eyes directly. "I know what I built. I know what I did and didn't do to protect it. The least I can do now is get out of the way fast enough for it to have a chance." Marsh was quiet for a moment. He stopped. "That's not the conversation I was prepared to have." "I know," Ethan said. "It's the one we're having anyway." They ate breakfast. They discussed the transition structure, the announcement language, the interim leadership question, the legal and contractual components. They were professional. They were efficient. And when it was done, and the check had been paid, and they were standing on the sidewalk, Marsh extended his hand again. "For what it's worth," Marsh said, "I always believed you had genuine talent, Ethan. I still believe that. I hope you—" He paused. "I hope you find your way back to it." Ethan shook his hand. "Thank you, Gerald," he said. He walked back to his car alone. The announcement went out 2 weeks later. Ethan Caldwell steps down as CEO of Caldwell Technologies, cites company's need for fresh strategic leadership. The language was his carefully drafted taking ownership, without self-flagellation, expressing confidence in the company's future, while being specific enough about his own role in its current difficulties to be credible. He had rewritten it 4 times. He wanted it to be honest. He was aware on some level that honesty was a new practice for him and required more effort than performance had. The market reacted moderately. The stock ticked up 3% on the news, which was the market's way of saying it had already priced in his departure, and was mildly relieved at the speed of it. The press was considerably less moderate. The coverage was, in a word, thorough. Several outlets ran side-by-side profiles. Ethan's fall alongside Charlotte's, Rise the ex-husband and the ex-wife, the man who had thrown away the marriage, and the woman who had turned out to be the most consequential tech figure of the year. The framing was obvious reductive, and also he could not pretend otherwise, not entirely wrong. He read some of it, not all of it. Enough. One profile in a business magazine he had been featured in twice before contained a line that he read 3 times and then set the magazine face down on his desk. The question is not whether Ethan Caldwell built something real. He did. The question is whether he understood at any point that he didn't build it alone. He left the magazine face down. The lawsuits came next. 3 shareholder class actions filed within 10 days of his departure. Each alleged mismanagement, insufficient disclosure of competitive risk, breach of fiduciary duty. His personal attorneys were excellent and expensive, and told him with the measured optimism of people who are paid to find reasons for optimism that exposure was manageable. He heard them. He paid their retainers. He felt about the whole process a deep and clarifying indifference that surprised even him, as though the lawsuits were happening to a version of himself. He was already separated from a version he had been watching from a distance for months. The creditors were less abstract. 3 weeks after his resignation, the company's primary lender, a banking consortium that held a significant portion of Caldwell Technologies' debt, initiated formal renegotiation of the credit facility. The terms they proposed were punishing. The company's CFO, Vanessa's interim replacement, called Ethan directly to tell him. He listened, offered what guidance he could, and told her she was doing the right things. She thanked him with a wariness that communicated she hadn't expected the call to go that way. He understood the wariness. He had earned it. The mansion had been in his name, their name technically, though Charlotte had made clear she wanted nothing from it. He had been making the carrying costs work while he was CEO, with compensation that now no longer existed. He listed it in the 4th week. His realtor, a cheerful professional woman who specialized in exactly this type of transaction and had clearly had a briefing about the circumstances, told him it was a seller's market and he would recover most of his equity. He nodded. He walked through the rooms one last time the evening before the listing went live. 9,000 square feet, 12 rooms, art on the walls that Charlotte had chosen quietly and without making a production of it during the first 2 years of their marriage. Pieces, she had said, would hold their value, which they had, which was the kind of thing he had filed away at the time as a pleasant incidental and understood now as the output of a mind that thought about everything more carefully than he had ever credited. He stood in the room that had been hers, the study on the 2nd floor where she had spent evenings. He was too busy or too absent to notice, and he looked at the empty bookshelves and the clean desk and the window that overlooked the garden, and he thought about how many evenings she had sat in this room while the rest of the house ran according to his schedule, his preferences, his needs. He had never once come in and asked what she was working on, not once in 11 years. The realization landed with a specific weight, quiet and total, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply sits down in the center of your chest and makes itself at home. He turned off the light. He left. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Midtown that cost considerably less than the monthly maintenance on the mansion, and was, he discovered gradually, not unpleasant. It had good light in the mornings. The building had a doorman named Hector, who was 61 years old and had opinions about baseball that he shared freely and without invitation. Ethan found himself improbably looking forward to the conversations with Hector in a way he couldn't entirely explain, something about the complete absence of agenda, of performance, of the exhausting theater of the world he had lived in for 20 years. One evening in the 6th week after his resignation, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Marcus Webb. "I'm calling to tell you something," Marcus said, "and I want you to hear it without reacting immediately." "That's never a good opening," Ethan said. "No," Marcus agreed. "Caldwell Technologies has accepted a buyout offer." Ethan was quiet. "From whom?" he said. A pause. "Hayes Nexus," Marcus said. The words landed differently than he expected. He had been braced for something, anger maybe, or humiliation, or the specific pain of a final loss. What he felt instead was something more complicated and more honest, something that was in some fraction he couldn't measure, almost like relief, like the last piece of a structure settling into its final position. "It was a fair offer," Marcus added. "Above market. The board accepted unanimously. The employees keep their jobs. The technology continues." "She's protecting the people," Ethan said slowly. "She's protecting the company," Marcus said. "What she built with it 11 years ago. She's not dismantling it. She's absorbing it, continuing it." Ethan sat with that for a long moment. Charlotte had spent 11 years protecting something that wasn't officially hers, and now it officially was. "The engineering team is actually there relieved, Ethan," Marcus said. "People are staying. The culture she's bringing in is different from what we had at the end. People feel it." A pause. "I'm staying too, for what it's worth." "Good," Ethan said, and he meant it completely. Are you all right?" Marcus said. Ethan looked around the apartment, at the clean walls, at the morning light already fading toward evening, at the coffee mug on the counter and the baseball he had on an impulse. He couldn't fully explain, purchased at a game Hector had persuaded him to attend last Saturday. "I'm getting there," he said. "That's better than nothing," Marcus said. "It is," Ethan agreed. "It really is." He hung up. He sat in the quiet of the apartment. The city moved outside, indifferent and relentless, and entirely unconcerned with the private education of a 42-year-old man who had built an empire on a foundation he never took the time to understand and lost it in the time it took to realize what had been holding it up. He picked up his coffee. I thought about Charlotte at the summit, the midnight blue dress, the steady voice, the eyes that held no uncertainty. He thought about what she had said, "I never needed your money, I only wanted your respect." He thought about 11 years of dinners where she had asked questions he hadn't answered, of galas where he had stood 40 feet away and chosen performance over presence, of a woman who had sat in a study on the second floor of a house he no longer owned and worked quietly on something that would outlast everything he had built. He thought about the check she had refused, $20 million. The number had felt like generosity when he offered it. He understood now what it had actually been, a price tag. He had put on 11 years of invisible work on a love that had propped up his entire life, on a woman whose name he had not thought to put beside his own on anything ever in 11 years. She had looked at that number and left it on his desk, not out of pride, out of accuracy, because $20 million was not even close to the right number, and they had both known it, and she had refused to pretend otherwise. He sat in his apartment and felt for the first time in as long as he could remember something other than fear or anger or the urgent performance of confidence. He felt very simply and without drama ashamed, not the public shame of the press coverage or the board meetings or the shareholder suits, the private kind, the kind that sits with you in quiet rooms, the kind that is, if you let it, the beginning of something better. Outside, a cab horn sounded. Someone laughed on the street below. The city went on, and Ethan Caldwell sat in the gathering dark of his smaller, quieter, more honest life, and he began slowly, imperfectly, without any guarantee of success, the hardest work he had ever attempted. The work of understanding who he had been, and deciding at last who he intended to become. The first real winter, after everything collapsed, was the coldest Ethan could remember, though he understood in the clearer part of his mind that the cold was partly internal. He had developed a routine, the kind of routine that forms not from ambition, but from necessity, from the understanding that structure is what keeps a person functional when the larger architecture of their life has been dismantled. He woke at 6, he made coffee. He walked 40 blocks through the city before the morning crowds thickened, because walking was the one activity that quieted the noise in his head to a manageable level. He came back. He read. He worked on the consulting projects that had begun trickling in smaller companies, earlier stage situations founders, who needed someone who had been at the top and fallen, and could therefore speak honestly about both. He charged reasonable fees. He did good work. He did not pretend to be something he was no longer. Hector the doorman had begun saving him a section of the morning paper, the actual physical paper, which Hector maintained was the only way to read news without being manipulated by an algorithm. Ethan had started reading it. He had started improbably agreeing. It was not the life he had planned. It was not the life he had built toward for 20 years. But he was discovering a life, an actual one, with texture and weight and the occasional genuine moment, which was more than he could say for the last several years of the previous version. I was 2 months into this new configuration when Marcus called on a Thursday evening in January. "There's something you should see," Marcus said. "Tonight, Channel 7, 9 o'clock. Charlotte is doing an interview." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "A television interview," he said. "A full-length profile. They've been filming it for 6 weeks, apparently. It covers Hayes Nexus, the acquisition, the whole year." Marcus paused. "It covers her marriage, briefly, but it covers it." Ethan looked at the television across the room. He had turned it on perhaps 4 times since moving into the apartment. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I thought you'd want to know," Marcus said. "I wasn't sure, but I thought—" "You were right," Ethan said. "Thank you." He hung up. He looked at the clock. 6:47. At dinner, he only half ate. He washed the dishes with the focused attention of a man using a small task to manage a large anxiety. He sat on the couch. He turned on the television at 8:53 and watched 7 minutes of a nature documentary about migratory birds without registering a single image. At 9 o'clock, the program began. The interviewer was a woman named Diane Collier, 60, authoritative. The kind of journalist who had conducted enough significant interviews to know that the best thing she could do was ask a clean question and then stay out of the way. She sat across from Charlotte in what appeared to be a sitting room, clean lines, warm light, the understated aesthetic of someone who has nothing to prove through their surroundings. Charlotte wore cream. Her hair was down. She looked rested in a way she had not Ethan realized watching her looked in the final years of their marriage, as though some sustained and low-grade tension had finally completely released. "You've had an extraordinary year," Diane began. "I've had an honest year," Charlotte said. "I'm not sure it was extraordinary so much as overdue. Hayes Nexus has been called the most significant enterprise platform launch in a decade. You've taken on a leadership role in one of the world's most influential private organizations. By any measure, you went from being almost invisible to being one of the most discussed figures in global business." Diane paused. "How does that feel?" Charlotte considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Strange," she said, "in the way that honest things often feel strange when you've spent a long time doing the opposite." She looked at her hands briefly, then back up. "I wasn't invisible because I had nothing to say. I was invisible because I chose to let someone else's story take up all the space. When you make that choice for long enough, you start to forget that the choice was voluntary. You start to confuse stepping back with being small." She paused. "I was never small. I just forgot that for a while." Ethan watched the screen without moving. "Your marriage ended this year," Diane said, and her tone shifted, careful, still direct, but aware of the weight of what she was approaching. "To Ethan Caldwell, the tech CEO whose company Hayes Nexus ultimately acquired. That relationship has become somewhat inevitably part of the story people are telling about your year." Charlotte's expression didn't close. It didn't harden. It simply became more precise. "It's part of the story," she agreed. "It's not the most important part." "What is the most important part?" "The most important part," Charlotte said slowly, "is what I learned about what I was willing to accept in exchange for love. I accepted invisibility. I accepted being looked through at events, being dismissed in conversations, being treated as a background feature in a life I was actively, quietly, significantly contributing to." She stopped. "And I accepted it because I believed that loving someone meant making space for them, even when they didn't make space for you. That if you loved someone enough and were patient enough and believed in them enough, eventually they would turn around and see you." And Diane said softly, "And sometimes they don't," Charlotte said. "Sometimes the person you've been quietly holding up will look at you after 11 years and hand you divorce papers and tell you you're holding them back." She said it without bitterness, without the performative wound that would have made it easier to watch, simpler to categorize. She said it the way you state a fact about weather. And that moment is painful, but it is also— She paused, and something genuine and undefended moved through her face. "It is also the moment you understand that you have been waiting for permission to be yourself, and that the permission was always yours to give." The room where Ethan was sitting was completely quiet. He had not moved in 4 minutes. "Do you blame him?" Diane asked. Charlotte thought about it, actually thought visibly the way people do when they are committed to answering honestly rather than performing an answer. "I understand him," she said finally, which is different from blaming him and different again from excusing him. She folded her hands in her lap. "Ethan is a man who was given a story about himself very early that he was exceptional, that he was the one who carried things, that success was the product of his vision, and everyone around him was support staff. And because the world kept confirming that story, because his company kept growing, and the magazine covers kept coming, and the praise kept arriving, he never had a reason to look underneath it." She paused. "I should have made him look. I was too careful of his ego, and not careful enough of the truth between us. That's my responsibility in it." Diane leaned forward slightly. "You're being remarkably generous towards someone whose company you effectively dismantled." For the first time, Charlotte smiled. Not the careful, managed smile of her earlier years. The real one, the one that reached her eyes, that had its own particular quality of warmth and precision combined. "I didn't dismantle his company," she said. "His company was already in the process of losing its foundation when I left. I simply stopped preventing the inevitable." The smile faded slightly. "And then I acquired it, yes, because the technology and the people inside it were genuinely good and deserved to continue. I wasn't interested in destruction. I never was." On the screen, Diane nodded. "What's the greatest lesson of your life?" she asked. "Not your professional life, your life." Charlotte was still for a moment. Then she said, "The people who love you when you have nothing are usually worth more than everything you own." Ethan's eyes were burning. Howe was not a man who cried easily. He was not a man who had cried much at all in the past 20 years, or perhaps longer. But something in those words, in the directness of them, in the absolute absence of drama with which she delivered them, bypassed every defense he had ever constructed and landed somewhere central and unprotected. He pressed the back of his hand briefly against his eyes. He breathed. The interview continued. Charlotte spoke about Hayes Nexus's next phase of development plans for expansion into healthcare logistics and climate infrastructure, a foundation she was establishing to fund education programs for first-generation entrepreneurs, a commitment to building a company culture that valued people the way her father had always quietly valued them. She spoke about Richard Hayes with a warmth that was unguarded and complete. She spoke about the team she was assembling, the decisions she was making, the kind of leader she intended to be. She did not mention Ethan again. She didn't need to. He had been present in the whole conversation, in the shape of the lesson, in the outline of the before and after, without ever being named again. He understood that this too was a kind of grace on her part. She could have named him more. She had chosen not to. He turned off the television when the interview ended. He sat in the silence. After a long time, he picked up his phone. He opened Charlotte's contact. He looked at it for a while. Then he opened a new email instead, because a phone call was something you could hang up on, and an email was something you could read when you were ready and respond to or not as you chose, and he wanted to give her that choice completely. He wrote the email 4 times before he got it right. The first version was too long, too explanatory, too full of the self-justification he was trying to move away from. The second was too brief, too clipped, the emotional equivalent of a form letter. The third was honest but disorganized. The fourth was what he actually meant. It said, "Charlotte, I watched the interview tonight. I'm not writing to ask for anything or to revisit anything or to change anything that's already been decided. I'm writing because I owe you a statement of record that I have never made directly and should have made years ago. What you built in your family's organization, in your own work, in the years you spent quietly and without credit, keeping things alive that should have been acknowledged, is extraordinary. You are extraordinary. Not because of the Hayes name or the platform or the profile, because of the quality of your character, which I had access to for 11 years and treated as ordinary when it was the furthest possible thing from it. I'm sorry. Not because I want anything from that statement, but because it's true, and you deserve to hear it said plainly. I hope Hayes Nexus becomes everything you're building it to be. I think it will. Ethan." He read it once more. He sent it before he could revise it a 5th time. Then he put the phone face down on the table and went to bed. He slept better than he had in months. In the morning there was no reply. He had not expected one. He had told himself he had not expected one, and he found, checking the phone at 6:15 with his coffee, that this was actually true. He had sent the email for the same reason Charlotte had spent 11 years doing things without credit, because it was the right thing, and the right thing doesn't require a receipt. He put the phone in his pocket and went for his walk. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday in February, his phone buzzed with an email notification from an address he almost didn't recognize, a Hayes Nexus domain, not the personal address he had written to. The subject line was blank. The body said, "Received. Thank you for writing it. C." 6 words. He read them standing on a street corner in the cold, with people moving past him in both directions, and the city doing what cities do, which is continue without pause, regardless of what is happening to the individual humans within them. 6 words. He exhaled slowly. He put the phone back in his pocket. He kept walking. That spring, Ethan began advising a small group of early-stage founders, not through a formal firm, not with a brand or a platform, or any of the apparatus he had once considered essential to credibility. Just one-on-one conversations in coffee shops and small conference rooms with people who were 2 or 3 years into building something and needed honest guidance from someone who had been all the way up and all the way back down, and had therefore developed a perspective that success alone doesn't provide. Howe was good at it, he discovered. Better in some ways than he had been at running the company, because he was no longer performing certainty he didn't feel. He could sit across from a 28-year-old founder who was making a version of a mistake he recognized and say without ego, without the need to be the smartest person in the room, I made this exact error at year 4. Here's what it cost me, and here's what I wish I'd done instead." And the founders to a person leaned forward when he said it, because the truth of it was audible, because they could hear that he had actually paid for what he was offering them. Marcus called in April. "There's something you should know," he said. It was becoming his standard opening, which Ethan had come to associate with news that mattered. "Tell me," Ethan said. "Charlotte is being profiled in 3 major publications simultaneously next month. All 3 are running cover stories." Marcus paused. "One of them, the Business Weekly, reached out to me for comment about the early years of Caldwell Technologies, about the culture, the decision-making, the people involved." Another pause. "They also asked if I thought you'd be willing to speak on the record." Ethan considered this. "What did you tell them?" he said. "I told them I'd ask you," Marcus said. "And Charlotte, does she know they're reaching out to me?" "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "I'd guess she does. Nothing in that organization happens without her awareness." Ethan thought about the email. 6 words. Received. Thank you for writing it. The closed-door quality of it, not cold, but complete. The sense that she had acknowledged what needed acknowledging and had no interest in reopening a room she had finished with. "Tell them I'll speak on the record," Ethan said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "About what exactly?" "About what she built," Ethan said. "About what I missed. About the early years of the company and who actually held it together." He paused. "She deserves to have the full story told accurately. If I can contribute to that, I should." Marcus was quiet long enough that Ethan wondered if the call had dropped. "Marcus," he said. "I'm here," Marcus said. His voice had a texture to it that Ethan couldn't quite categorize. I'm proud of you, for whatever that's worth." It landed unexpectedly, the simple directness of it, the absence of qualification. "It's worth something," Ethan said. "Thank you." The interview ran in May 6 pages alongside the other profiles. The journalist who spoke with Ethan was a careful, thorough woman who asked good questions and listened to the answers without rushing to fill the silence. He told her about Cornerstone Ventures. He told her about the Year 3 logistics crisis. He told her about the 11 years of invisible work and the ways he had systematically failed to see it. He told her that Charlotte Hayes was the most capable person he had encountered in his professional life, and that he had not understood that until after he had made the decision to end their marriage. The journalist, to her credit, simply wrote what he said, accurately, without editorial coloring, his words on the page in print attributed to him by name. He had never done anything that required more honesty and cost less money. The piece ran under the headline, "The Woman Who Built It Twice." Ethan's section was titled simply, "What He Missed." He read it at Hector's insistence. Hector had inexplicably found and purchased a copy the morning it came out and left it folded to the right page on the lobby desk with a sticky note that said, "Good man," which Ethan thought was perhaps the most generous 2 words anyone had offered him all year. Summer came. Ethan was consulting with 6 founders now. He had turned down 2 others, one because the product had ethical dimensions. He wasn't comfortable with one because the founder was recognizably a version of who Ethan had been at 35 and was not yet ready to hear anything other than confirmation of his own genius, and there was no useful work Ethan could do for someone in that particular place. He had referred them both to others. He had done it without drama. He exercised. He read. He went to 2 baseball games with Hector, who knew every statistic about every player with the passion of someone who had found in this one domain a complete and guilt-free joy. Ethan found himself absorbing Hector's enthusiasm by proximity and discovering with some surprise that he had opinions about the season. He had not had opinions about anything not related to technology or business in longer than he could remember. It turned out that having opinions about baseball was in its small way a form of being alive. In July, he received an unexpected phone call from a number he didn't recognize, a Geneva area code, which he recognized after a moment's confusion, because it was the area code he had seen on Charlotte's family's correspondence during the 11 years he had paid insufficient attention. He answered, "Mr. Caldwell." A man's voice, older, precise with the contained, unhurried quality of someone accustomed to speaking at a pace that communicated authority without requiring volume. Ethan knew immediately. "Mr. Hayes," he said. "Richard," the man said. "I think we're past formalities." Ethan sat down. "I've been meaning to call for some time," Richard Hayes said. "I've been following your year with interest, the work you're doing with the founders, the interview in May." A pause. Charlotte showed it to me. She didn't comment on it. She just put it on my desk and left the room, which if you know my daughter at all, you'll understand was its own form of comment. I think I'm beginning to understand her better than I did, Ethan said carefully. Yes, Richard said. That much is apparent. Another pause. The deliberate weighted pause of a man who says exactly what he means and no more than that. I'm not calling to offer reconciliation or resolution or any kind of tidy ending to what happened between you and Charlotte. That's not my place, and it's not my intention. I understand, Ethan said. I'm calling because I've been in this business for 50 years, Richard said, and I've watched a great many men reach the top of significant enterprises and believe with complete sincerity that they got there by themselves. And I've watched what happens to those men when the scaffolding around them is removed. He stopped. Most of them react badly. They fight. They litigate. They find someone to blame and prosecute that blame for years. They build the failure into a narrative that exonerates them, and they live inside that narrative and it ruins them. A pause. You didn't do that. Ethan was quiet. I want you to know, Richard said, that I see that, and I respect it. A man who can look at what he had and what he lost and take honest account of his role in it, that is not nothing. That is, in my experience, quite rare. I had a lot of help seeing it clearly, Ethan said. From Marcus, he stopped. From your daughter, honestly, from the things she said, the things she chose not to say. She's like her mother in that way, Richard said with a warmth that arrived unexpectedly and altered the quality of the whole conversation. Her mother believed that the most important things you communicate to someone are often the things you don't say, but demonstrate consistently over time. A pause. Charlotte demonstrated a great deal to you. I'm glad some of it finally landed. It landed, Ethan said quietly. It just landed too late. Maybe, Richard said, or maybe the timing was exactly what it needed to be, for both of you. He let that sit for a moment. I wanted to make this call. I've made it. I wish you well, Ethan. I mean that genuinely. Thank you, Richard, Ethan said, for the call, and for... He stopped because what he wanted to say was vast and unwieldy and couldn't be compressed into a phone call. For what your family did, in the early years, when it mattered. It was Charlotte, Richard said simply. That was always Charlotte. The line went quiet. Goodbye, Ethan. Goodbye, Richard. He held the phone in his hand after the call ended and sat without moving for a long time. That was always Charlotte. I thought about a girl, a young woman really, 28 years old when they had met, who had walked into a room at a mutual friend's dinner party and sat across from him and listened to him talk for 40 minutes about his company's potential and asked 3 questions at intervals that were so precise and so structurally insightful that he had been startled into silence each time, had reoriented his entire thinking on the subject, and had attributed the clarity not to her questions, but to his own process of working through the problem out loud. She had known what she was doing. She had let him have it. She had been from the very beginning exactly who she was, and he had spent 11 years editing her down to something smaller that was easier to categorize. That was always Charlotte. In October, a year and 2 months after she had signed the divorce papers in his office, Ethan attended a small conference, genuinely small, 40 people, focused on ethical frameworks in AI development. He had been invited to speak, which still occasionally surprised him, because he was no longer the name that drew rooms, and had made his peace with that, in the same way you make peace with any weather you cannot change. Hy gave his talk. It was honest, specific, and less polished than anything he had delivered in his previous life, which made it considerably more useful. He spoke about building without accountability, about the gap between visibility and value, about the specific blindness that success can produce in the people it touches. He did not use Charlotte's name. He did not need to. Afterward, a young woman in the audience, 25 maybe, with the particular intensity of someone who has been building something for 3 years on very little sleep and less money, came up to him and said, "The part about the people around you holding things together without credit. I think that's happening in my company, and I don't know what to do about it." Ethan looked at her. "Start by seeing it," he said. "Actually seeing it. Not just knowing it's happening, but sitting with it long enough that it becomes real to you. Names, contributions, specifics. Then say it out loud to the people involved. Not in a meeting, not in a memo. Directly, face to face." He paused. "And then build your entire culture around the understanding that the loudest person in the room is almost never the most important one." She wrote it down. He watched her write it and thought about all the people who had offered him this exact wisdom in various forms over 11 years, and how completely consistently and impressively he had failed to hear it. He thanked her for the question. He meant it. On the train home that evening, he thought about Charlotte's final words in the television interview. The people who love you when you have nothing are usually worth more than everything you own. He had been turning those words over for months now, wearing them smooth with repeated handling the way you do with a stone you carry in your pocket. He thought he understood them now in a way he hadn't when he first heard them, not as a judgment on him specifically, though they were that, but as a principle of attention, a guide to where to look, a reminder that the most significant things in a life are almost never the loudest. He had built a billion-dollar company and mistaken it for proof that he had understood what mattered. He had lost the billion-dollar company and discovered in the losing that he had been standing on something real all along without ever looking down to see it. Charlotte had been the foundation. He had been the building, and buildings without foundations do not stand. He arrived home. Hector was on duty. They talked for 7 minutes about the playoff situation, which Hector believed was straightforward, and which Ethan believed was more complicated, and they were both right in their own ways, which was, he thought, probably the most accurate description of most important things. He went upstairs. Hayamada tea, he had started drinking tea in the evenings, which would have surprised the version of himself from 2 years ago, who had considered anything other than coffee or whiskey a form of capitulation. He sat by the window. He thought about the year, about what had been lost and what had been found, and the complicated, non-linear, genuinely human way those two things coexisted without canceling each other out. He had lost an empire. He had found his actual size smaller than the empire and therefore real, and therefore something that could grow again on an honest foundation rather than an invisible one. He had lost a marriage. He had found in the loss of it the first accurate understanding of what the marriage had actually been, what it had cost her, and what she had offered, and what he had failed to receive. He had lost the story he had told about himself for 20 years, and in the quiet of a smaller, lighter, more honest life, in a 2-bedroom apartment with good morning light and a doorman named Hector, and 6 founders who needed someone to tell them the truth, he was writing slowly and without performance a different one. Not a story about power or empire or being the person who built it all. A story about a man who was given everything, understood nothing, lost it all, and finally learned to pay attention. It was not a triumphant story, but it was a true one. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell understood that true was worth more than triumphant, every single time.